It seems to me, David, that what you have done in talking about the inequities that are tied up in American domination of material goods really speak to a very basic crisis in the American value structure. And that crisis has to do with ecology, after all, our relationship to our environment, does it not?
Sure. One of the ironies is we call the Soviets materialists, but we act as if we were materialists. Sure. Our whole foreign policy is conducted on the assumption that what matters is our control of the material resources of the planet.
And our despoliation of, our destruction of the environment, relentless, which has been a kind of traditional labor-saving device in American development.
Yes. Another one of the problems with most traditional Christianity and Judaism and Islam is that they have been totally anthropocentric. Mm-hmm. That is, we have assumed that human beings were the only things that had any value in the universe, and that the rest of the world was here simply for our use, and that's the way God intended it.
Mm-hmm. And we made God in our image, so he'd better agree.
That's right. And so we have defined the rest of the world as material resources. So all these other wonderfully beautiful creatures, mm-hmm. We lump them all under our material resources. Yeah. And we're willing now to destroy all of this for the sake of preserving the American standard of living. Now, I suggest if we would really start rethinking what it is we believe in, and if in fact we would come to believe in a non-materialist view of the universe, mm-hmm. and believe that their ultimate values didn't hinge upon those things, that we need material resources for to a certain level simply to live, we would be more willing to let the other people who need their fair share have those. Mm-hmm. Therefore, they would be less inclined to be led to desperate moves to try to win their fair share or to get even with us because of our mm-hmm. Imperialistic, exploitative ways. And so, in this sense, I see a, quote, return to religion, but I don't mean a return to the traditional religion, but a return to really not putting our ultimate faith mm-hmm. in material things and in brute power as necessary to save this beautiful planet.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's of course we talk among American historians, we talk of the conquest of the continent without ever considering that what we were doing was overawing an Indian, an Aboriginal population. And it's very interesting, I think, in the light of the things you're saying, that we are only now coming to a new appreciation of the values of the Native American population that was here. Those values that have to do with stewardship, living within the framework of an existing environment and so on.
Certainly the arrogance of traditional Christianity, believing it had the exclusive possession of all worthwhile truth, mm-hmm. has contributed to the present arrogance of the American nation, where we had believed that essentially no one else had any wisdom worthwhile. And so the world we not only thought was for human beings, we thought it was for Christians. Yeah. And so not only would we despoil what we call the natural environment, but also other peoples who believe differently. So either they had to be converted to our way of thinking. Mm-hmm. Now, another thing that process theology is most concerned about is giving us a way of thinking that leads not to a complete relativism, where we simply say, well, all traditions are equal, or they're somehow mm-hmm. all saying the same thing. That just doesn't seem to be the case. Mm-hmm. But to be open to the various truths and values that are in the different traditions. So we believe that other peoples do have important things to learn from Christians. We have a very important message to share. But at the same time, we have important messages to learn about truth and value from them.
And we have to be open to those and,
Yes.
and to
And precisely
process
this reverence for the rest of the universe is one of the values that many of the religions had that we were very weak on.
David, as a matter by now of profound curiosity on my part, and I suspect part of many others who are watching us, how did you come to these beliefs initially? As I understand, you had started out to be a trumpet player.
That's right.
So how did we get from that aspiration to the things that we're talking about? Where was the twig bent?
It all started by going to a fraternity party one night.
Really? Literally?
Literally. Many people have seen Animal House. That was filmed at the University of Oregon. I started at the University of Oregon. I joined a fraternity just down the street from there, and I went to a party that was not quite as bad as the ones at Animal House, but it did lead me to raise the question. I'd had grown up in the church. I'd been a leader in the youth movement, but I really hadn't raised the question, what is life all about? And it was that party, plus the realization that I didn't love music at that time as much as I had assumed I did, to give my whole life to it. That combination led me to start thinking about what my deepest values and concerns were, so I decided to go into the ministry. And then as I started studying that, these kinds of questions, the ultimate theological questions of the nature of the universe and the ultimate meaning of our lives, so captivated me that I found that that was my true love and the thing I wanted to devote the rest of my life to.
And you grew up in a small time and really a relatively rural environment. You're not a big city boy.
No, small town, good values.
The
very
Cooley Dam and all of that.
Yes, all of the good things that come from that, and all the bad things. And of course, they're about equal. The bad things being a very provincial way of seeing things. My hometown Christianity was not something that could withstand critical scrutiny. But it did, I think, instill a deep concern in me and a commitment to the creator of this universe and a desire to try to live as much as I could my life in harmony with the will or the preferences of this creator as much as I could figure out what they might be, and to try to help other people live that way. Now, in those days, I was, as I said, provincial and very short-sighted, and I didn't see all these questions about nuclear holocaust, and I certainly didn't see how they were so tied up with certain theological positions. So I didn't come to this position in order to solve the nuclear issue, but after coming to it because of the problem of evil and other problems, now I see that this way of thinking about power is very pertinent to this, and I'm more and more seeing that we really need to see that there are these two basic kinds of power. The one is the power of love, evocative, persuasive power, and the other is the power of coercion that can destroy values but can't create them. And that our ultimate commitment is to this power that I see as the power of God, and that we can say with Paul at the end of Romans 8, where he says, who can be against you if God is for you? That is the most timely message, I think, of our era. And then later on in that chapter he says, what can separate us from the love of God? And then he goes through a whole litany of things, neither powers, nor principalities, nor life, nor death, and now I would say, nor nuclear holocaust can separate us from the love of God. And so even though nuclear destruction of our planet would perhaps be the worst tragedy the universe has ever suffered, it's not an ultimate tragedy in that it destroys all meaning, because we will never be separated from this loving God who brought us into existence.
Now that, of course, is a statement of faith, not blind faith, as you were referring to it earlier. That supposes that faith is not blind, that faith is a way of seeing.
There's a long tradition called faith-seeking reason. And you realize you begin with a certain clue, a certain hunch about things. Then the task is to carry it out test it against experience and against logical reasoning and see if it makes sense.
But again, this is a highly individual matter, isn't it? And you see, if I'm understanding you correctly, the point at which you turned in the direction that we've been discussing was the point at which you were trying to discover who David Griffin is. That is, what is the significance, what is the meaning of your life?
Yeah, because my meaning, I can have no meaning apart from this whole that we're a part of.
Sure.
And that's what theology is all about.
You see, I'm delighted that you said that, because I think to a great many people, really quite serious people, theology is so abstract and so far removed from everyday concerns as to be incomprehensible and irrelevant.
And the traditional image of what theology is makes it so different from what we now call scientific ways of thinking, that people think that's a whole nother world, as they say.
Sure.
And quite often in editorials, a theological argument is used as a derogatory term.
Right.
And of course, that's well taken in regard to much of what theology has been. But of course, if one's going to look back in previous centuries, much of what we call science is something we would laugh at now today also. Well, if I can make a pitch here, one thing I want to do is say that the most exciting study is theology today, because it deals with every question from physics to ethical questions about nuclear holocaust to the question of the theory of evolution. It encompasses everything. And what we need today are more young people, the brightest and the best, who see theology as one of the most relevant and important things they can do in relation to the salvation of the world, but also one of the most exciting things they can do in terms of their own personal quest and growth.
Now, this is a quite remarkable thing that you've done, because we begin with the kind of skepticism and urge to atheism and paralysis that comes as a result of the preponderance of evil in the world, and scarcely 45 minutes later, you're making a pitch to all of the best and the brightest young people to come to theology.
Not only that, to the School of Theology at Claremont.
Well,
because there are schools of theology that do another kind of theology, and that I wouldn't recommend people to go into. But us and some other schools I would recommend very highly.
Well, what I will do is pause now for some commercial words and then come back and talk about the Center for Process Theology, because I gather that is really what you're pouring a great deal of your energy into these days. So we should know something about it.
Okay.
David, the Center for Process Theology or Process Studies, is that, what is it, and what is it doing?
Okay. It's a center that my colleague John Cobb and I started at the School of Theology at Claremont, Claremont Graduate School, 10 years ago, where it's based upon the process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne primarily. It's a school of thought that has been around for 50 years. We're devoted to trying to overcome the fragmentation of the modern world, in which we've increasingly fragmented into specialized subjects where people know a lot about physics or one subdiscipline within physics, but know nothing about philosophy or theology or even biology or sometimes even chemistry. And what we're trying to do is show that Whitehead's thought gives us a basis in which we can bring things back together. So it's a form of what is now called holistic thinking, but unlike many forms of what's called holistic thinking, it is not fuzzy. Whitehead was
rigorous.
Whitehead was a mathematician and a logician for most of his life. Of course, he was Bertrand Russell's math teacher, and they collaborated on some very difficult, precise works.
And he sought to bring together the theoretically opposed worlds of science and religion.
Right. And so both science and religion and the various religions and then what are called the social sciences. So we're hoping, in fact, to go at this in a bigger way in our next decade and get rather major funding to bring together, say, 12 people who would represent 12 of the traditional disciplines. Let them sit down and study and work together for 10 years. So you would have a physicist, a psychologist, a chemist, a biologist, an ethicist, a theologian, and so on. And let them try to develop what I'm calling now a postmodern worldview. The modern worldview has been with us from the 17th to the 20th century. It has served its function. The inadequacies of it are becoming more and more clear. So we're ready now to move to a postmodern worldview that will incorporate all the truths and values of that, but also include many of the things that it had excluded.
And chief among the things that it excluded were what?
Okay, a sense of the life of all things that would lead us to a reverence for nature, a sense that values can be experienced, so we can have knowledge about values. Those aren't just arbitrary, subjective things. That the universe is really a whole, not just a bunch of atomistic separated fragments, that every part relates to every other part, and also every part is included in the whole, which we understand as God. God is involved in each part, and every part is included in God.
So you're putting it all back together again.
We're doing what we can.
Which is part of why it's such a delight to be at one with you.
Thank you.
Which we have been doing this past hour. And so the Center for Process Studies is not going to confine itself to mere theology.
No, in fact, the first 10 years we've devoted ourselves primarily to non-theological topics, to the questions of science and the interrelation of the sciences and so forth. Now we're starting in the second decade. We're trying to go even further with that, but we've also started a new program in the center that we're calling Faith and Process, where we're going to be devoted to theology and trying to develop theology for lay people. We've had some reputation for being difficult to read. That is, the books that we've produced thus far. And more the churches have been calling to us to produce materials that lay people can read.
Dogs and cats can understand.
And so we're starting to do that now.
Sure, yeah. I think that's commendable. I also think it's very necessary, because it's all too easy to function at the level of an elite group